What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a list of the CRPGs and TRPGs that I am particularly excited for, and kind of things you can look forward to in that genre as we move towards the end of this year and into 2023. People who watch the channel regularly will of course know that I love CRPGs. They are a big focus of what we cover here on the channel, but unfortunately they do tend to be few and far between when it comes to actual releases, so I thought it would be fun to make a video like this and talk about some of the things we have to look forward to in this genre. But I did also want to mention at the start of the video here that there are a few games that are not on this list by design. In most cases, this is because these are games that have not received any sort of update on their development status in quite some time, 1 to 2 years in a few cases, and as such I deliberately chose not to include them. This would be titles like, say, Realms Beyond, for instance. Looks pretty cool, but they haven't done an update in years, so it's probably not gonna happen. And there is actually one other title that would be on this list if I was allowed to talk about it, but I am not. You guys should hear about that one before too long. Now, with no further ado, let's actually jump into this, and let's start with the two heavyweights that are quite widely known. Obviously, we have Baldur's Gate 3 really being the only AAA title on this list. I don't think I have to tell too many people watching a video like this about this game in any sort of synopsis. It is anticipated next year, we'll say. They haven't released any sort of formal release dates, but they have said, Larian Studios that is shooting for next year, which is about as specific as we've gotten. Now, just to give an opinion on this one real quick, I think BG3 is likely going to be a fantastic game, but I am curious to see how the launch of it is going to go, as it has been in early access for quite some time, and it has kind of fallen off of people's radar as a result. So I'm curious if the launch is going to be enough to pull people back in and build up some real hype. Time will tell on that one. Now, the other big game we have on this list is, of course, Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader. This is another one we don't really have a release date on, but it is sort of the first CRPG in the Warhammer universe. There are, of course, other types of RPGs that have been made for Warhammer 40k, but Rogue Trader is definitely the first CRPG. This, of course, being from Owlcat Games, whose Pathfinder titles feature on this particular channel quite regularly. And beyond just being the first entry of this type for Warhammer 40k, which brings all sorts of new approaches to things like the lore, characters, the gameplay itself, I'm also very curious to see how Owlcat Games fares with a game that isn't Pathfinder, as we already know that the combat system is going to be quite different, but it will be turn-based combat that is significantly different from Pathfinder, of course. And we'll be taking on the role of the Rogue Trader, which is a sort of merchant with a significant amount of power granted to them to run their business the way they see fit, which leads to some opportunities for some unique storytelling in a universe that tends to be a bit stringent with the Imperium versus Chaos stuff. Owlcat has said that this game should follow more or less its previous development times for the Pathfinder titles, which would see us with a release late next year, but obviously that's too far out to make any concrete assumptions. But with any luck, we'll be seeing alpha and beta in the months to come. Now, let's move on to the slightly more known, but still kind of lesser known stuff. Starting with Dark Envoy. This is a game that was actually supposed to be out a while ago, but as you might imagine, things like COVID pretty significantly delayed it. However, it is a game that is still receiving updates, that kind of thing. They actually recently overhauled the Steam page for it, interestingly enough, added a lot of new art, that type of thing. So with any luck, 2023 will finally be the year that we get this one. But it is from Event Horizon, which are the developers behind the Tower of Time game, which is an interesting title I've reviewed before actually, just so I would have a frame of reference for when this game actually launches. But Dark Envoy itself looks to be largely adapting the combat system from Tower of Time, or at least the major parts of it. That is to say, it's sort of real time with pause, but you get abilities that allow you to like draw the area of effect, for instance. But the game itself revolves around two siblings as a war between a more technology-focused empire and a magic-oriented empire kind of comes to a head. A lot of the game seems to be filled with magic-fueled technology, which overall is kind of an interesting premise that we don't see too much of these days. And like I said earlier, hopefully we'll see this one before too long. Next up on our list, we have Colony Ship, a post-apocalyptic role-playing game. This one is from the developers of The Age of Decadence, known as Iron Tower Studios. However, where The Age of Decadence is a sort of post-apocalyptic Rome, Colony Ship takes place on a generational ship out in space. And the generations of the characters that you're going to be playing are never going to see either the destination or the place they departed from, and as such, there's a ton of conflicts on the ship itself, which is a really interesting premise for a game like this, and there's a lot of really interesting things going around with like religion and who's in charge of the actual ship, that kind of stuff. And this is a game you can actually play in early access right now. They are shooting for a, I believe, summer release of 2023 if my memory serves. And what is available right now has been quite solid. The thing to know here though is it has a pretty unique combat system in that it can be a bit punishing if you don't know what you're doing, so I would recommend checking out the combat demo before you dived in head first, but it is a very rewarding role-playing game if you spend some time with it. Now from here, we're going to talk about a few TRPGs. For starters, we have Marvel's Midnight Suns. This is a TRPG, of course, set in the Marvel universe, where we play as all sorts of superheroes and take place in tactical turn-based battles. However, I do have some reservations about this one personally. I am willing to give it a fair shake, but for starters, it uses a mechanic that I'm not really fond of in these types of games, which is the card mechanic, where your characters that you're playing will draw cards and then use those as their abilities, which I've never, again, personally been a big fan of. But the other part of this that concerns me is, quite frankly, the marketing, really. So the game's been delayed a couple of times, which again is no big deal with everything going on in the world these days. However, when you actually look at the pre-purchase options for games like this, they have a Legendary Edition available for like $100. And if you actually look at what's in it, it's basically just a ton of skins and a season pass. And given the corporate world's tendency to milk franchises like this for absolutely everything they're worth, makes me reserved about this game, quite frankly. I will give it a fair shake. It releases in December, on the December 2nd, I believe specifically, and only time will really tell if this one turns out to be good or just kind of a bust, because like I said, I have some reservations on that one. But that brings us to our next title, and that is Cybernight's Flashpoint. This one is an interesting one that kind of popped up on my radar relatively recently, and the first thing that jumps to mind when I look at this particular game is Shadowrun. It is a game where we are a team of mercenaries, hackers, that type of thing, that perform heists and other illegal activities in a sort of cyberpunk dystopia. And while I haven't seen anything that directly implies magic like Shadowrun has, it definitely gives me Shadowrun vibes, and obviously has a cyberpunk genre going on. Now, this particular game tends to have more or less the trappings of what you'd expect from a TRPG these days. However, this one in particular, at least in its marketing, claims to have evolving characters, as it calls it, where things like choices and things that actually happen to your characters in a fight will affect them and then alter that character in some way. So I'm kind of curious to see how that pans out. But this particular game is looking at an early 2023 release according to its Steam page, but no exact dates or anything. But it definitely looks like a cool title. And lastly, I wanted to talk about some more narrative-driven games that are definitely shaping up to be pretty promising. I don't know necessarily that you would lump them in with the CRPG, TRPG genre, but nonetheless, I'm looking forward to them. And first up, we have Sovereign Syndicate. In this particular game, we follow the story of three characters in a sort of Victorian steampunk-esque age, and it's a type of game that takes heavy inspiration from things like Disco Elysium. And moreover, this particular game actually has a demo out, so if you go to the Steam page, you can actually just try it out for yourself right now, as it definitely has a lot of cool ideas. You get to play as a lot of magical creatures. And of course, there's a pretty big focus on the actual story. And the second title in this kind of vein is Broken Roads. Broken Roads is a sort of post-apocalyptic game, but this one is set in Australia. They say they take inspiration from things like, again, Disco Elysium, but also Baldur's Gate and even Fallout. Now, an interesting thing about Broken Roads is that it boasts turn-based combat, as well as a sort of expansive morality system. Now, the morality system isn't necessarily new to narrative types of games. However, the turn-based combat in a game that is, again, more narratively driven is actually unusual. A lot of times these games will handle combat through, say, text events, whereas this one seems to be aiming for some level of actual combat. And I'm looking forward to seeing how it kind of melds those two things together. But that said, that is pretty much all I've got for you guys, all of the CRPG and TRPG games that I'm looking forward to. Again, there are other games that might eventually see a release but haven't got updated in a while and thus are not on this particular list That said, guys, that's pretty much all I've got for you. I certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.